What's up, everybody? So, second video for tonight. Yeah, it's been a few hours. I got distracted. But, on the plus side, we get Boo here. She's very lovey tonight. Probably just means she's hungry. Anyway, let me get to the point. So, tonight's video is about planning for the future with your children and looking to the future, maybe even perhaps for yourself, based off world history. So one of the grievances I had, I wouldn't necessarily call it a grievance. I would call it a lack of foresight. Um, from the time, my parents were baby boomers. So, my whole youth was ingrained into me, go to college and you'll be successful. Go to college and you'll be able to afford a house. Go to college and it was college, and you're okay. And in the time of the baby boomers, that was actually true. That worked for them. But the short-sightedness of it is they didn't take into account that the world dynamics were going to change, the economic dynamics were going to change. So this whole, by the time I graduated college, this whole if you went to college, you're fine was null and void. It no longer mattered that you went to college. As a matter of fact, for every job interview I've ever been to, and they see my college degree at the bottom of my resume, they didn't even ask about it. They didn't even give a fuck. Um, Not two fucks given. A college degree now is equivalent to a high school, degree, maybe even a GED. Nobody gives a fuck if you went to college, not unless you've gone extensively in one field, very specifically, up to probably master's or higher. Then it matters. But a bachelor's degree is, fucking wipe your ass with it. It doesn't matter. All you're doing is putting yourself in debt getting a master's degree. And that was the mindset of my parents. They were doing the best they could. They lacked the foresight to see that, by the time that putting myself in their shoes, by the time that my kid is old enough to join the workforce, this might not be applicable anymore. And sure enough, it was not. Yet they still want to hold to that gun for whatever reason, even though it's just basically, it doesn't take a genius to realize that shit doesn't work anymore. It's better not having a college degree, but it really doesn't put you in a position of immediate or guaranteed success that the baby boomer generation would have had. And that's not me complaining, because I got lucky. I was also raised in a large majority by my grandparents. And what my grandparents taught me was, completely different. It was more along the lines of being morally righteous, and to, know how to work with your hands. And it just so happens that ended up being more advantageous in my life than the college degree ever was or ever will be. I would not learn my trade, would not be able to start my business without that influence with my grandparents saying, work with your hands, number one. And number two, the way that I treat clients, being morally righteous and treating people with respect and not fucking people over, not extending my greed upon them, has paid off in dividends because people these days are tired of getting fucked over. They find me, they say, hey, he's not fucking me over. I'm going to keep coming back. So I got lucky for sure in that aspect. So what I want people to do and what I want people to think and start to think along these lines is if you have kids, if they're young, or if you're going to have kids soon, or when I plan to have kids, there are certain sets of things that, yes, I absolutely will teach them. Um, predominantly about morality and, you know, facing reality and, basically just a general healthy mindset, how to think for yourself and so on and so forth. Those are things that obviously every child should be taught no matter what generation they're in. That's just what I would consider classical knowledge, or should be classical knowledge. However, it doesn't hurt to plan ahead in positioning your children into a position that they can do, you know, better for themselves. And why was I thinking about this? So I was thinking about, really how my parents' idea of what I should be doing was totally wrong. And had I followed their ideas too, well, I did, but had I followed them more, I would have been so fucked. And had I not listened to my grandparents, I would have been completely fucked. Um, so what you have to understand is that all because your generation was this way, the future generation is probably not going to be that way. It's going to be very, very different. So if you raise your kids with this one mindset of do this, do this, do this because it worked for me, by the time they get to, career age, that's going to be completely unapplicable. Like it's not going to matter anymore. So you're going to have to think ahead if you want your kids to have an upper hand. And here's what I see with this. So in the 60s, I think it was the 50s or 60s, China did this whole thing called down from the mountains, up from the valley. And the whole idea behind it was grand. It was basically, let's homogenize the people, because in China at that time there were two very different classes. You had the poor working farm hands, and then the city dwelling, you know, I don't know what you would call them, but more up to date financial advisors, lawyers, things like that. So they did this thing that they down from the mountains, up from the valley, to help try to homogenize. So what they did is they forced children from well-off areas or well-off families to go up to the mountains to farm and learn how to farm and get schooled in farms. And they forced children that were not educated and basically not well off down to the cities, to the rich, well-educated schools, in order to try to level everybody out. Um, it failed. We'll get to that in a minute. But you know, I see that in America today. This forced homogenization with affirmative action and with government-assisted housing and so on and so forth. I would call it like reverse gentrification. Really, it's failing. It's not working. I was in college uh, after one semester making 3.8 GPA, taking 18 hours one semester and 21 hours the next semester, busting my fucking ass. And, that paid off. I got into a better school. I got into that better school, and I think I was in like calculus or something. And because of affirmative action, there were people in there that couldn't even add 2 plus 2. I fucking shit you not. They were like bricks as far as intelligence. So I saw this forced homogenization not working early on. And I see it more and more, day by day. I see it not working. But America's doing it, just not as forcefully as China did. The next thing that happened in China shortly after that is basically what happened was like the government, I wouldn't say manipulated, but granted children the right to be like, okay, fuck authority, do whatever the fuck you want. During this time period, there were Chinese that were like, the schools basically shut down. the Chinese were, just letting kids get away with everything. Kids were running around spray painting the schools and tearing up the cities. And what do you see now in America? There's this whole generation, slightly younger than me, the millennial, that are running around doing whatever the fuck they want, and narcissistic as shit, and tearing everything up. It's the exact same thing again. So then this is the way that I see the world going. By looking at the past, you can dictate the future most of the time. That's the whole point of learning history, is so that X, Y, and Z can lead up to, something else. And I see that happening. So, you know, the correlation is blatantly obvious. So what I encourage you to think about, and what I encourage you to think about encouraging your kids in the future to do, given that this is a situation. First, you have to ask, well, okay, what happened to this generation in China? They're now called the lost generation. Huge percentage of them are unemployed. Um, they basically are completely unproductive to society. They still have this air of narcissism where they don't believe they need to do anything. They're rude as fuck to everybody. Um, and the younger generation is intolerable of them because they're so, narcissistic, really. And they're tired of them sitting around doing jack shit. Um, so, if you take into account all these things, you can say, okay, what's going to happen to this millennial generation, in the next 20 to 30 years? Well, if we judge from world history and what happened in China, which is awfully fucking relevant, they're going to be lazy pieces of shit that aren't going to want to do anything. So, with that being in mind, this can go a lot deeper. I'm not going to explain it all to you if you want to research the subject for sure. But if you want to set your kids up, your future kids or your kids now up for success, I would suggest maybe looking at what, the nouveau riche of China are doing. Because there's some super, super, super young and incredibly rich people in China that have taken advantage of, their parents' lack of, education and lack of, I don't know what you fucking want to call it, but they've taken advantage of their parents' mistakes. I see the exact same trend happening here in America. Um, so research that. I already have several ideas of what I'll probably be teaching my kids. Um, if I ever have any, God knows. I might already have some, I don't know. But I promise you I don't have kids. Um, Start thinking along those lines. Don't run under the assumption that what worked for me is going to work for my kids. The world changes so quickly now. That's not the case. You know, for one example, just to get your mind spurred, in China, it became property value. That's why you see all the ghost cities and all this stuff, is because the, uh, the newer generation was buying up property in anticipation of it getting bought out, which a lot of it did, and that's how these people went from like broke as hell to super rich in practically no time, because their parents weren't, that narcissistic lost generation weren't buying this property. It was all abandoned and abused and fucked up. So along those lines, start thinking that. What would you teach your kids? How are you gonna, you know, plan for their future? Because their future is not going to be the same as what you would expect it to be ever. Um, this is also just the importance of having an education. Um, you know, and I'm just eternally grateful for having my grandparents' influence, because it just so happens that their mindset worked out phenomenally for me today. Um, But had they not been there and I only listened to my parents, I would probably be like a fucking barista at Starbucks coffee right now, you know? So, don't be ignorant. Have an open mind. Teach your kids morals and important things, but also try to guide them in a path that you think will probably be successful. Um, I guess this is going on way too long, but you get my point.